A forgotten war hero walks into an airport and gets treated like a nobody. But when the world finds out who he really is, everything changes. Betrayal, redemption, and a fight for justice. This is the story of Elliot Gaines, a man who refused to be erased. Stay with us because this one, it's personal. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The scent of old leather and aged paper filled the small study, mingling with the faint aroma of black coffee resting on the wooden desk. Elliot Gaines sat in his worn-out armchair, flipping through the pages of a book he had read countless times before. Outside, the late autumn breeze rattled the windows, whispering against the glass, a stark contrast to the steady stillness inside. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards whenever he shifted his weight. It was a modest home, tucked away in the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, far enough from the city noise but close enough to the world he once knew. He never cared for extravagance. Even now, after a lifetime of service, he lived as if he were still a young airman on base, accustomed to simplicity, discipline, and solitude. A low chime echoed from his phone, drawing him back from his thoughts. He picked it up, squinting at the screen. It was a notification from the Veterans Affairs Office, an automated reminder about the upcoming ceremony in Washington, D.C. Elliot exhaled through his nose, setting the phone back down without responding. He never asked for recognition. In his prime, he had flown missions most men wouldn't dare, had risked his life more times than he could count, and had watched good soldiers fall, some because of bad luck, others because of decisions he had to make. Those medals in the old wooden box by his bedside meant little compared to the weight he carried in his chest. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He stood, stretching his stiff legs, and made his way to the entrance. When he opened the door, a familiar figure greeted him with a smirk. "You gonna pretend you forgot about the trip?" Lucas Burns stood there, hands in his pockets, wearing the same worn leather jacket he had for years. Elliot sighed. "I was hoping you had." Lucas chuckled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Not a chance, old man. You need to pack. Flight's in the morning." Elliot closed the door behind him, rubbing his temple. Lucas had always been persistent, one of the few who never let him drift too far into his own silence. They had crossed paths in the military years ago. Though they never flew together, Lucas, a former Marine, had been one of the men on the ground during a mission Elliot piloted. That mission had saved his life. Since then, Lucas never let Elliot slip away into obscurity. "You really think this is necessary?" Elliot muttered as he moved toward the kitchen, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. Lucas leaned against the counter, watching him. "It's not about you, Elliot. It's about what you represent. The men who never got their recognition. The ones who came home to nothing." Elliot's grip on the mug tightened slightly. He knew Lucas was right. He had seen it too many times. Men who had given everything only to return to a world that had already moved on without them. "Besides," Lucas continued, a knowing glint in his eye, "it's not every day they drag out an old warhorse like you for a ceremony. Might as well enjoy the free flight." Elliot scoffed, shaking his head. "You're insufferable." "Yeah, but I'm right." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Elliot stared at his coffee for a moment before finally speaking. "Fine, I'll go." Lucas grinned. "Good, pack light, and for the love of God, don't bring that damn old bomber jacket. You'll look like you just crawled out of 1965. Elliot smirked but said nothing. That jacket had been with him through hell and back. He wasn't about to leave it behind now. As the evening stretched on, he packed his small duffel bag, folding his clothes with the precision of a man who had spent decades in uniform. He glanced at the wooden box on his nightstand, debating whether to bring it. In the end, he left it where it was. Tomorrow he would board that plane. He would step back into a world that had long forgotten his name. But tonight, in the quiet of his home, he allowed himself one last moment of peace before the storm. The steady hum of airport chatter filled the air as Elliot stepped into Monroe Jacobs International, a place that had become more of a machine than a terminal. The polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, and automated announcements droned on in an indifferent tone. Travelers rushed past, some dragging heavy suitcases, others clutching coffee cups and boarding passes like lifelines. Lucas walked a step ahead, scanning the departure board. "Gate B14, he muttered. "We've got some time." Elliot adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, feeling the familiar weight settle on his shoulder. He had always packed light. Old habits die hard. His leather jacket, scuffed from years of wear, was zipped up against the artificial chill of the terminal. He hated airports. Too many lines, too many rules, too many people who thought authority was the same as power. They made their way towards security, the line stretching longer than Elliot had patience for. He watched as people shuffled forward, stripping off belts, emptying pockets, placing their belongings in plastic bins. The process was methodical, almost robotic. A few rows ahead, a woman with a toddler struggled with her stroller, while the agent on duty tapped impatiently at the conveyor belt. The man behind her, dressed in a sharp suit, exhaled loudly, checking his watch as if every second lost was a personal attack. Elliot sighed. "This is why I hate flying." Lucas smirked. "Well, you could have driven to D.C., but something tells me your truck wouldn't survive the trip." Elliot grunted in response, stepping forward as the line inched ahead. When it was finally their turn, Lucas moved through first, tossing his jacket into a bin and stepping into the body scanner without issue. Elliot followed, placing his duffel on the conveyor belt and slipping off his jacket, revealing the simple button-down he wore underneath. He stepped forward, hands raised as instructed. Then the red light blinked. The agent monitoring the screen frowned, leaning in slightly. "Step aside, sir." Elliot did as he was told, though his jaw tightened. He had seen this play out before. "Is there an issue?" Lucas asked, already turning back toward him. "Random screening," the agent said, barely looking up. Lucas scoffed. "Right." Random. Elliot said nothing, though his patience began to fray. He had spent years flying missions across enemy skies, had put his life on the line more times than he could count, and now here he was, being treated like a security risk at an airport in his own country. A second agent, a younger man with a rigid posture and an authoritative air, stepped in. His name tag read, Walsh. "Sir, I need you to step into the screening area," Walsh instructed, his voice flat but firm. Elliot met his gaze. He saw it immediately. The look, the assumption. He had seen it too many times before. Lucas started to object, but Elliot lifted a hand to silence him. "Let's just get this over with." He followed Walsh into a separate area, a small enclosed space with a metal table and a secondary scanner. His duffel bag had already been pulled aside. Walsh unzipped the bag, rifling through it without hesitation. Clothes, a book, a shaving kit. Nothing unusual. Then his hand paused on a small velvet pouch. "What's this?" Walsh asked, holding it up. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched as the man untied the strings and emptied the contents into his palm. A worn metal insignia fell onto the table with a soft clink, the symbol of a distinguished flying cross. Walsh frowned, clearly unfamiliar with what he was holding. "What's this supposed to be?" Lucas, who had somehow managed to slip past the barrier, leaned against the doorframe. "That, my friend, is a medal for extraordinary aerial achievement, given to very few people. And this guy here, he earned it." Walsh barely reacted, setting the medal aside like it was a trinket. "We still need to complete the check." Elliot exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to remain still as the pat-down began. Every movement was mechanical, every touch impersonal. By the time they were done, his patience had thinned to a thread. "You're clear," Walsh finally said, though there was no apology in his tone. Elliot took his belongings back in silence, slipping the medal back into its pouch with deliberate care. Lucas shook his head. "This is unbelievable." Elliot only responded once they were out of earshot. "It's not unbelievable. It's just America." Lucas opened his mouth to argue, but he stopped himself. There was nothing he could say that Elliot hadn't already learned the hard way. They walked toward their gate in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down like an invisible wall between them. Elliot settled into a chair near the terminal window, his duffel bag resting at his feet. The airport outside stretched endlessly, runways crisscrossing like veins over the earth. Planes rumbled in the distance, lifting off into the overcast sky, vanishing into the clouds as if they had never been there at all. Lucas sat beside him, arms crossed, leg bouncing slightly, an old Marine habit that never quite faded. You okay? Elliot exhaled, running a hand over his face. Yeah. Lucas wasn't convinced. You sure? Because what happened back there sure as hell didn't sit right with me. Elliot leaned forward, clasping his hands together. It's not the first time. Lucas frowned. That's the problem. Silence stretched between them, thick with words left unsaid. Elliot knew Lucas was waiting for him to acknowledge it, to let himself be angry. But what was the point? It wouldn't change anything. A woman's voice came over the intercom, announcing a flight to New York. The sound barely registered. Lucas huffed. You know, I remember hearing stories about you when I was still green in the Corps. You were a ghost, man. They said you could fly into hell and come back untouched. Elliot smirked faintly, shaking his head. They exaggerated. Maybe, Lucas admitted, but not by much. And yet, here we are. Some kid in a uniform, treating you like a damn suspect. Elliot's fingers curled slightly. He thought of all the men he had flown with, some who never came home. They had given everything, believing that one day their service would mean something. And yet, even now, in a country they had fought for, men like him still had to prove they belonged. I stopped expecting gratitude a long time ago, Elliot said finally. The world moves on. People forget. Lucas studied him, then leaned back. Well, I haven't. Elliot glanced at him, brow raised. Lucas shrugged. I haven't forgotten what you did that night in Helmand. You didn't have to take that risk, but you did, and that's why I'm still breathing. Elliot looked away, his jaw tightening. He had spent years trying to forget that mission. The weight of it still pressed against his ribs like a stone. You ever wonder why I stuck around? Lucas asked, his voice quieter now. It's not just because you saved my ass. It's because I knew guys like you weren't getting the respect they deserved. And if no one else was going to remind the world who you are, then hell, I'd do it myself. Elliot shook his head, but there was no irritation in it, just exhaustion. You never did know when to quit, Lucas grinned. Nope. The intercom crackled to life again, this time announcing the boarding call for their flight. Lucas stretched, grabbing his carry-on. Come on, old man, let's get this over with. Elliot stood, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. As they made their way toward the gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was about to be far more than just a ceremony. Something was coming. He could feel it. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he was ready. The hum of the airplane cabin was steady, a low white noise that blended with the occasional chime of seatbelt signs and muffled conversations. Elliot sat by the window, his eyes drifting over the tarmac as the plane taxied toward the runway. The sky outside had darkened, streaks of orange and violet stretching across the horizon like an artist's brushstrokes. Lucas settled into the seat beside him, adjusting his tray table before glancing over. You always this quiet on flights? Elliot didn't look away from the window. Used to be different when I was the one flying. Lucas smirked. Bet the controls made you feel like you had some say in what happened. Elliot let out a low chuckle. Something like that. The plane lurched as it began its ascent, pressing them back into their seats. Elliot barely noticed. His body still carried the memory of turbulence, of sudden drops, of engines roaring as he pulled up from a steep dive. He had spent decades in the sky, pushing aircraft to their limits. This question mark. This was nothing. Lucas, however, didn't seem as comfortable. His fingers tapped idly on his armrest, a restless energy coiling beneath his skin. You ever think about those old missions? He asked, voice lower now, like a confession. Elliot finally turned to him, studying the way his jaw tensed. Which one? Lucas exhaled. The one in Helmand, the night you got me out. Elliot had known that was coming. It was a mission most people wouldn't remember. A squad of Marines pinned down in a valley, surrounded, cut off. The air support window had been closing fast. Elliot had been ordered to hold back, to wait for clearance. He hadn't. He had flown in anyway, low and fast, dodging enemy fire as he extracted the last surviving men. It had been a reckless move. It had also been the only reason Lucas and a handful of others had made it out alive. Elliot could still hear the screams over the radio, the sound of bullets ricocheting off steel, the brief moment of silence before he had gunned the engines and pulled them out. You think about it? Lucas asked again. Elliot met his gaze. Not in the way you do. Lucas huffed a laugh, shaking his head. You ever regret it? Elliot didn't answer right away. Regret wasn't the right word. He had made his choices. He had lived with them. I regret the ones I couldn't save, he said finally. Lucas's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He nodded, as if understanding something unspoken. The flight attendant came by, offering drinks. Lucas ordered whiskey. Elliot just asked for water. As the plane leveled out, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Lucas took a sip of his drink, rolling the glass between his fingers. You know, they're gonna make you talk at this thing, right? Elliot arched a brow. Talk? Yeah, say something about your service, about what it means to be honored. Elliot let out a slow breath. I don't do speeches. Lucas grinned. Then you better learn quick, old man. Elliot didn't respond, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. He hadn't come here to tell war stories. He hadn't come to relive the past. But something told him, whether he wanted to or not, he wasn't leaving Washington without confronting the ghost he'd tried so hard to outrun. The city greeted them with cold wind and distant sirens, the kind of sounds that never truly faded in a place like Washington, D.C. The cab ride from the airport was quiet, save for the occasional honk of impatient drivers and the rhythmic tap of Lucas's fingers against the armrest. Elliot watched the streets blur past, rows of historic buildings standing against the ever-changing skyline. He had been here before, years ago, but it felt different now. Back then, he had arrived as a soldier, someone passing through unnoticed, unimportant. This time, people were expecting him. Not that he wanted them to. Lucas glanced over. You ever think you'd be back here for something like this? Elliot shook his head. Didn't think I'd be back here at all. The cab pulled up in front of the hotel, a towering structure with pristine glass doors and a uniformed doorman waiting outside. The kind of place where men in suits held quiet conversations over bourbon, where everything smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne. Elliot stepped out, slinging his duffel over his shoulder as Lucas paid the driver. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. Inside, the warmth of the lobby was immediate. The carpet muffled their footsteps as they made their way to the check-in desk. A woman with a practiced smile greeted them. Welcome to the Arlington Grand. Checking in? Lucas leaned on the counter. Yeah, should be under Gaines. Her fingers moved across the keyboard before she paused, glancing at Elliot. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. Ah, yes, Mr. Gaines, she said, her voice smoothing out. Your room is ready, and there's a note for you. Elliot frowned as she handed over a small envelope. The handwriting was neat, formal. He tucked it into his jacket without opening it. Lucas watched him. You got fans already? Doubt it. They took the elevator up, the ride filled with soft instrumental music that felt out of place. Their rooms were adjacent, separated by a narrow hallway, lined with framed photos of past presidents shaking hands with important men. Elliot unlocked his door and stepped inside. The room was as expected, crisp white sheets, a desk positioned near a window that overlooked the city. He dropped his duffel onto the bed and pulled out the envelope. The note inside was brief. Mr. Gaines, looking forward to speaking with you. Kirby W. Elliot exhaled sharply. Senator Charles Whitmore. Lucas's voice carried from the hallway. We're grabbing dinner, right? Because I refuse to let you sulk in that room all night. Elliot smirked to himself before tucking the note away. Yeah, he called back. I'm coming. Tomorrow, the real reason he was here would begin. But tonight, he'd let himself pretend, just for a little while, that this was just another trip. Even if he knew better, the steakhouse was the kind of place that had been around forever. Dim lighting, dark wood, the scent of charred meat and aged whiskey hanging in the air. It was where politicians made deals over bourbon, where retired generals swapped war stories, and where men like Elliot Gaines were either ignored or noticed for all the wrong reasons. Lucas slid into the booth across from him, scanning the menu with mild interest. This place has the best ribeye in the city. Figure you might as well eat something decent before they throw you up on a stage tomorrow. Elliot smirked, setting his napkin in his lap. You act like I'm about to walk into a firing squad. Lucas raised a brow. Ain't that what it is? Elliot didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what tomorrow meant. Being paraded around as a symbol, forced to shake hands with men who didn't know his name a week ago. He had spent a lifetime staying in the shadows. Now they wanted to put him in the spotlight. The waiter came, and they ordered without much thought. Lucas got the ribeye. Elliot settled for something smaller. He wasn't here to enjoy himself. As the waiter left, Lucas leaned in, lowering his voice. You gonna tell me what was in that note? Elliot sighed, leaning back. Senator Whitmore? He wants to talk. Lucas whistled. That can't be good. I don't know what he wants, Elliot admitted, but I doubt it's just a handshake and a photo. Lucas tapped his fingers against the table, his expression unreadable. You ever think about what comes after this? Elliot frowned. After what? This whole thing, Lucas said. Tomorrow you stand up there, they say your name, people clap, and then what? You shake a few hands, fly back home, and disappear again? Elliot didn't respond right away. That had been the plan. Come to D.C., get through the ceremony, go home. But something in his gut told him it wouldn't be that simple. Lucas studied him. You don't have to do this alone, you know. Elliot met his gaze. I've been doing it alone for a long time. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. Yeah, and how's that been working out for you? The food arrived before Elliot had to answer. They ate in silence, the sounds of the restaurant filling the space between them. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the storm brewing in the life of a man who had spent years trying to outrun it. Elliot pushed his plate aside, rubbing his temple. Let's get out of here. Lucas tossed some cash on the table. My thoughts exactly. They stepped outside into the cold D.C. night, the air crisp against their skin. Streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the Capitol loomed in the distance, a reminder that some battles never truly ended. Elliot adjusted his jacket, glancing down the street. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Lucas smirked. Yeah, and something tells me it's just getting started. Elliot didn't argue. He just kept walking, the weight of something unseen pressing down on him with every step. The night was thick with tension as Elliot stepped out of the hotel, the chilly Washington air cutting through his worn jacket. He paused on the sidewalk, staring up at the flickering neon sign of a nearby newsstand. Somewhere in the city, a camera was rolling, capturing moments he'd rather forget. But tonight, fate had other plans. Earlier that evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, reviewing memories he wished he could bury, his phone buzzed incessantly. Lucas had already mentioned something about a video spreading like wildfire online, but Elliot hadn't paid it much mind, until now. A friend of Lucas, a bystander who had recorded the humiliating security incident at the airport, had posted the clip on social media. In a matter of hours, the video had exploded into a full-blown media frenzy. Elliot's inbox was filled with messages. One moment he was an anonymous veteran, and the next his face was plastered across local news websites and national headlines. Phrases like "forgotten hero" and "humiliated at home" flashed in bold across screens. A well-known network even aired a segment titled "The Veteran No One Saw Coming." The sound bites were relentless, and every report painted him as a symbol of a broader injustice. A man forced to endure indignity in a system that was supposed to honor him. On a busy street corner, Lucas met him near a small cafe that had become an impromptu gathering spot for curious onlookers and journalists. Lucas's eyes were wide with both excitement and concern. Elliot, you won't believe it. They're calling you a hero and a victim all at once. Check this out, he said, handing over his phone. Lucas had retweeted several stories and comments that rained praise for Elliot's decades of sacrifice and scorn for how he was treated today. Elliot took the phone slowly, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he scrolled through the endless stream of tweets, blog posts, and video clips. Every headline stung, every comment was a reminder of a time when his contributions went unnoticed. They're celebrating my failures as a system, he murmured, voice low and heavy with resignation. A reporter from a prominent network approached them, microphone in hand and eyes sparkling with the promise of a big story. Mr. Gaines, can you tell us how it feels to be treated like a relic in your own country? She asked, her tone both sympathetic and probing. Her question, delivered with practiced precision, echoed off the cold pavement and into the night. Elliot's mind raced. Every instinct told him to remain silent, to let the chaos speak for itself. Yet a small, persistent voice urged him to finally reclaim his narrative. Inside the cafe, a cluster of veterans huddled over coffee, their conversations a mix of pride and sorrow. One older gentleman, his voice raspy but firm, declared, "Elliot did more for this country than most of these suits ever will. We stand by him." His words rippled through the gathering, forging a subtle bond among those who had long been forgotten by a society that now seemed desperate to remember them. Elliot felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. The public acclaim was a bitter pill. On one hand, it validated decades of sacrifice, yet on the other, it underscored how little respect he had ever truly received. The flood of attention was overwhelming, each notification a reminder of a broken system that now, ironically, had to face its own contradictions. He wondered, not for the first time, if this was his moment to finally speak out about the injustices faced by veterans like him. A deep, introspective silence settled over him as he took a long sip of lukewarm coffee. The reporter's question lingered in his mind, and the voices of countless unseen veterans whispered in the background. "I'm not here to demand sympathy," he finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm here to remind everyone that the price of freedom isn't paid in empty promises. It's paid in blood, sweat, and sacrifice." Lucas clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, Elliot. Maybe this storm will wash away the stains of neglect." But even as Lucas spoke, Elliot couldn't shake the uncertainty gnawing at him. What did he truly want from all this attention? Was it time to step out of the shadows and let the world know his real story? Or would he let the media's frenzy dictate his fate? The night grew deeper, and the city lights blurred into a tapestry of hope and despair. Elliot's thoughts drifted to the countless comrades who had never had their day in the sun, to the silent struggles that no camera could ever capture. As the chatter of reporters and the murmur of onlookers swirled around him, Elliot made a quiet promise to himself. This was more than just a media storm. It was a call to action. He knew that tomorrow, when he stepped onto that stage, every word would carry the weight of his past, every pause a testament to the lives that had been sacrificed. And as he walked away from the glowing newsstand, the murmurs of the city seemed to echo his own inner resolve. The storm was just beginning, and in its eye, Elliot Gaines was about to rediscover his voice. The morning arrived with the slow hum of a city already awake. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Elliot's hotel room, casting long shadows across the neatly made bed. He had been up for hours, pacing near the window, the weight of the day pressing against his chest. He had faced countless missions, sat in cockpits with engines roaring beneath him, felt the ground shake under his boots in places he never wanted to return to. But this was different. This wasn't about strategy or survival. This was about stepping into a world he had spent years avoiding. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He pulled it open to find Lucas standing there, already dressed, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Figured you'd need this," he said, handing it over. Elliot took it with a small nod, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a sip. "You know, you don't have to follow me around like a damn shadow." Lucas smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Sure I do. Somebody's got to make sure you don't sneak out the back." Elliot huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. He wasn't going to run. Not yet, anyway. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with activity. Journalists loitered near the entrance, their cameras ready, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had unknowingly become a symbol overnight. Lucas nudged him toward a side exit. Better to avoid the circus for now. The ride to the event hall was quiet. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced at Elliot through the rearview mirror. "Heard about what happened at the airport," he said after a moment. "Damn shame the way they treated you." Elliot wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded. The venue was a grand old building, the kind meant for speeches and handshakes, for men in suits exchanging polite words that meant nothing. A crowd had already gathered, reporters mixing with politicians, military officials, and veterans from different generations. Lucas adjusted his jacket. "You ready for this?" Elliot exhaled. Number. But that's never stopped me before. Inside, the hall was set up with rows of chairs facing a stage, a podium standing tall at the center. A large banner behind it bore the words, "Honoring Our Nation's Heroes." Senator Charles Whitmore was already there, greeting people with the ease of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of the firm handshake. When he spotted Elliot, his expression shifted to something unreadable. He extended a hand. "Mr. Gaines, it's an honor." Elliot hesitated for the briefest moment before shaking it. "Senator," Whitmore gestured toward a quieter corner. "Do you have a moment?" Lucas gave Elliot a look, one that said he'd be watching, but he didn't follow. Whitmore led Elliot away from the crowd, his voice lowering slightly. "I wanted to speak with you before you go up there. What happened to you at that airport? The way this country has treated its veterans? It's unacceptable." Elliot crossed his arms. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Whitmore smiled, the kind of polished smile politicians wore when they were trying to convince you they were on your side. "I believe you could be the voice this country needs right now. People are listening. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a position on the Veterans Affairs Advisory Board." Elliot stiffened. He hadn't expected that. Whitmore continued, "You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it. When you speak today, don't just remind them of what's been lost. Show them what can still be done." Elliot studied him for a long moment. He had spent years believing no one cared, that the world had moved on without him. Now they wanted him to stand in the spotlight. Before he could respond, an organizer approached. "Mr. Gaines, we're ready for you." Elliot gave Whitmore one last look before heading toward the stage. The room quieted as he stepped up to the podium. The lights felt too bright, the eyes on him too heavy. He cleared his throat. "I wasn't planning to speak today," he started, his voice rough but steady. "Hell, I didn't even think I'd be here." A few quiet chuckles from the crowd, but most remained still, listening. "I've served this country for most of my life. I flew missions in places people would rather forget. I lost good men, friends, brothers, and when I came home, I realized something. It wasn't the enemy that made me feel invisible. It was my own country." A murmur rippled through the audience, but Elliot didn't stop. "I was a soldier, a pilot, a man who was willing to give everything. But yesterday, in an airport in my own country, I was treated like a suspect. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised." Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. "I know I'm not the only one. I know there are thousands of veterans out there who gave their lives to this nation, only to come home and be ignored. And that's why I'm standing here today. Not because I want your sympathy, but because I refuse to let this keep happening." A slow clap started from somewhere in the back, then grew, spreading until the entire room was on their feet. Elliot stepped back from the podium, the weight in his chest shifting, maybe not disappearing, but settling into something else, something like purpose. As he left the stage, Lucas met him with a grin. "You sure you don't do speeches?" Elliot smirked. "Guess I do now." But in the back of his mind, Whitmore's offer lingered. And for the first time, Elliot wondered if maybe, just maybe, his fight wasn't over yet. The applause had barely faded when Elliot stepped off the stage. The weight of what he had just said still hung in the air, lingering in the silence between conversations, in the eyes of men who had once been invisible like him. He had spoken his truth, but now, as he moved through the crowded hall, he realized that speaking was only the beginning. Lucas clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "You just shook the damn room." Elliot exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Did I?" Lucas chuckled. "Hell yeah, you did. You got people thinking, and that's more than most of these guys have done in years." Before Elliot could respond, Senator Whitmore was back, his presence commanding as he navigated the space with ease. He extended his hand once more, and this time, there was something heavier behind his expression. "That was a hell of a speech, Mr. Gaines," Whitmore said. "Exactly what this country needed to hear." Elliot shook his hand, but his gaze remained wary. "I didn't say anything people didn't already know." Whitmore smiled. "Maybe, but the difference is, they listened to you." Lucas folded his arms beside them, watching the exchange carefully. Whitmore continued, I meant what I said earlier. We need someone like you. Someone who knows what it means to be forgotten. Someone who can make sure it doesn't keep happening. Elliot narrowed his eyes. And you think I'm that guy? Whitmore's expression didn't waver. I do. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. There's a meeting in a few days with the Veterans Affairs Committee. I'd like you to be there. Elliot took the card but didn't immediately look at it. Why me? Because you're not a politician, Whitmore said simply. And that's exactly what we need. Before Elliot could respond, another senator called Whitmore's name from across the room. The older man gave Elliot a small nod. Think about it, and if you're interested, we'll be waiting. As Whitmore walked away, Elliot felt the weight of the card in his palm. It was small, insignificant on its own, but it carried the possibility of something much bigger than himself. Lucas exhaled beside him. Damn, that's big. Elliot finally looked at the card. The words were simple, direct. An invitation to step into a world he had never wanted to be a part of. Yeah, he muttered. It is. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but something told him the choice had already been made. The night air was cool against Elliot's skin as he stepped outside the venue, the noise of the event fading behind him. The city stretched out in front of him, towering buildings casting long shadows under streetlights. He took a slow breath, the weight of the day pressing against his ribs. Lucas followed, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. You ever think about it? Elliot glanced over. Think about what? The guys we lost, Lucas said, his voice quieter now. The ones who never got a chance to stand where we are. Elliot didn't answer right away. The memories were always there, just beneath the surface. Names, faces, moments frozen in time. I think about them every damn day, he finally said. Lucas nodded, staring out at the traffic moving sluggishly through the streets. I saw a guy today, Marine, probably in his 70s. He came up to me after your speech, said he'd never heard anyone say what you did out loud before. Said it made him feel seen. Elliot clenched his jaw. Took long enough. Lucas turned toward him. That's why you got to do this, Elliot. Not for Whitmore, not for politicians, for them, for us. Elliot looked down at the card still clutched in his hand. The meeting was in 2 days. A decision had to be made. Lucas clapped him on the back. Come on, let's get a drink. You look like you could use one. Elliot gave a short nod, slipping the card into his pocket. The ghosts of the past were always there. But for the first time in a long time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could give them a voice. And if he could, then maybe it was finally time to stop running. The conference room was colder than Elliot expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of place where decisions were made over stiff coffee and formal nods, where lives were shaped by people who had never set foot in the battles they discussed. The long mahogany table stretched between him and the members of the Veterans Affairs Committee. At the head sat Senator Whitmore, flanked by half a dozen other officials, most of them older, dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than Elliot's truck. Lucas had insisted on coming with him, but waited outside, letting Elliot face this alone. Whitmore leaned forward, clasping his hands. Mr. Gaines, thank you for coming. Elliot gave a short nod. Wasn't sure I would. A woman on Whitmore's left, Senator Reed, studied him over the rim of her glasses. You've certainly stirred conversation over the last few days. Elliot shrugged. Didn't mean to. A chuckle rippled through the table, though it lacked warmth. Whitmore smiled, but it was the kind politicians wore when they wanted something. You said something in your speech that stuck with me, Whitmore continued. That coming home made you feel more invisible than the war ever did. Elliot met his gaze. That's because it's true. Silence settled over the room. The senators exchanged glances, as if unprepared for the bluntness. Whitmore nodded slowly. That's exactly why you're here. We want to change that. Elliot leaned back in his chair, skeptical. You want to change it now? After how many years? Senator Reed cleared her throat. We're not here to make excuses. The system has flaws, we know that. But the public response to your situation shows that people care. And right now, we have an opportunity to do something about it. Elliot crossed his arms. And what exactly do you want from me? Whitmore exchanged a look with Reed before speaking. A seat on the Veterans Advisory Board. You'd have a say in policy changes. You'd be able to advocate for the men and women who don't have a voice. Elliot studied them carefully. He had spent years watching men in power make promises they never intended to keep. And yet, his mind drifted back to the Marine at the event, the way the man had looked at him with something close to relief. The way Lucas had said, "This is why you have to do this." Elliot exhaled. "I'm not a politician." Whitmore smiled. "That's why you're perfect for the job." For the first time, Elliot considered it, really considered it. And maybe, just maybe, this was a fight worth stepping into. The decision weighed on Elliot as he left the Capitol. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city, but he barely noticed. His mind was still in that room, still turning over the offer in his head. Lucas fell into step beside him. "So? You in?" Elliot rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know yet." Lucas let out a short laugh. "Come on, man. You've already decided. You just don't want to say it out loud." Elliot gave him a look, but Lucas wasn't wrong. They reached the hotel, stepping through the revolving doors into the lobby. The moment they did, Elliot felt it, a shift in the air, the way conversations hushed ever so slightly. Then he saw it. Across the room, Derek Walsh, the former airport security officer, was seated near the bar, drink in hand, but his gaze was locked on Elliot. There was something about the way he sat, too relaxed, too casual, like a man who had nothing left to lose. Lucas noticed too. "Well, look who it is. Thought we left him in the dust." Elliot didn't reply. He wasn't interested in another confrontation. He started toward the elevator, but Walsh called out, "You think you won?" Elliot stopped, turned. Walsh smirked, standing slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his wrinkled suit. "You think just because they put your face on the news, you've changed something?" Lucas took a step forward, but Elliot lifted a hand, stopping him. His eyes stayed on Walsh. "You have something to say?" Walsh chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm just saying, guys like you come and go. The system stays the same." Elliot held his gaze for a long moment. Then without a word, he turned and walked away. Because that was the thing Walsh didn't understand. Guys like Elliot Gaines, they didn't just come and go. They changed the game entirely. Elliot sat alone in his hotel room, the city's glow stretching across the darkened sky beyond the window. The events of the past few days had unfolded like a storm, unexpected, relentless, and impossible to ignore. He had come to Washington expecting nothing more than a ceremony, but now he stood at the edge of something far bigger than himself. The Veterans Advisory Board. A chance to be the voice he had never sought but had somehow become. Lucas had been right. Elliot had already made his decision. He just hadn't admitted it yet. His fingers drummed against the armrest of the chair, his mind replaying his conversation with Whitmore. You'd be able to advocate for the men and women who don't have a voice. A voice. The thought unsettled him. He had spent decades existing in silence. A soldier who had done his duty and walked away, expecting nothing. But now the silence had been shattered. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned, pushing himself up, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. When he opened the door, a man in a dark suit stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Gaines," he said, his voice low but firm. "A word?" Elliot narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" The man produced a business card and handed it over. Harrison Tate, private consultant. No company name. No official title. Just a name and a phone number. "I work with people who have an interest in the decisions being made in this city," Tate continued. "People who prefer that certain changes don't happen." Elliot's grip on the card tightened. "Is that so?" Tate smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're making a lot of noise, Mr. Gaines. Some people don't like that." Elliot stared at him, his heartbeat slow but steady. He had faced men like this before, not in suits but in uniforms, on battlefields where threats weren't wrapped in polite words. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Tate's smile didn't falter. "I'm saying that the system works just fine the way it is, and people with your kind of influence, well, they have a choice. They can step away quietly, or they can find out just how difficult life can become when they don't. Elliot let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You think you can intimidate me? Tate tilted his head slightly. I think you're smart enough to understand the game being played here. Elliot took a step closer, lowering his voice. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Tate. I've been shot at. I've been hunted. I've watched men die right in front of me. And you think a cheap suit and a vague threat are enough to make me walk away? Tate's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. I think you should reconsider your position. Elliot didn't blink. I think you should reconsider yours. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Tate gave a small nod, slipping his card back into his pocket. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Gaines. And just like that, he turned and walked away. Elliot shut the door, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just about a position on a board. This was about control, about keeping men like him silent. And that wasn't going to happen. Lucas paced the hotel room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. You should have told me about this sooner. Elliot leaned against the dresser, arms folded, expression unreadable. And what? You think I don't know what this is? Lucas exhaled sharply. You think they'll stop with one visit? No, Elliot admitted. I don't. Lucas shook his head, frustration evident in his posture. This is bigger than you, Elliot. You step into this. You're not just fighting for veterans anymore. You're fighting against people who have a hell of a lot more power than you. Elliot met his gaze evenly. So what do you suggest? That I back down? Lucas hesitated. I'm saying you should be prepared. Elliot's mouth twitched slightly. I've been prepared my whole damn life. Lucas let out a dry laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. You stubborn old bastard. Elliot smirked. That's why you like me. Lucas's face grew serious again. So what's the plan? Elliot reached into his pocket, pulling out Whitmore's business card and flipping it between his fingers. We show up, we make noise, and we make sure they know we're not going anywhere. Lucas nodded. Then I guess we better make sure they hear us loud and clear. The game had changed, and this time, Elliot wasn't playing by their rules. The halls of the Capitol were colder than Elliot remembered, not in temperature, but in the way power settled into the walls, in the way men in suits walked with a confidence that came from years of control. Lucas walked beside him, silent but watchful. He had always been a fighter, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where words carried the weight of bullets. They stepped into the meeting room, where members of the Veterans Affairs Committee sat waiting. Senator Whitmore was at the head of the table, his face unreadable. Elliot took a seat. Whitmore leaned forward. Mr. Gaines, you're here today because your voice has become one that people are listening to. Elliot clasped his hands together. Didn't plan on it. A few of the senators chuckled. Whitmore smiled, but it was tempered. That's why we need you, because you're not here for power, and you're not here for politics. You're here because you know what it's like to be ignored. Elliot stayed silent. Whitmore cleared his throat. There are forces at play that don't want to see change. You've already felt that firsthand. Elliot nodded slowly. Tate. The room shifted. No one looked surprised. Whitmore sighed. He's not the only one. Elliot clenched his jaw. He had suspected as much. Whitmore leaned forward. The truth is, we're at a turning point. The public is watching. The media is watching. And that means we have a window, an opportunity to push for real reform. Elliot studied him. And you think putting me in the middle of it is going to help? Whitmore smiled. I think putting someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth is going to help. Elliot exhaled. He had spent years staying out of these fights. Now he was standing in the center of one. Lucas, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. You already know what he's going to say. Whitmore's expression didn't change. I do. Elliot leaned back. Then let's get to work. The press conference was scheduled for noon. The room was packed, reporters, cameras, politicians all waiting for a statement from the man who had unexpectedly become a symbol. Elliot stood behind the podium, his hands steady on the edges. The weight of expectation settled on his shoulders. He cleared his throat. I never wanted to be here. Silence fell over the room. I never wanted recognition, I never wanted my name in headlines. I did my job, and I came home. He let the words sink in before continuing. But coming home shouldn't mean being forgotten. It shouldn't mean being ignored. It shouldn't mean having to fight just to be seen. Lucas stood off to the side, nodding. Elliot exhaled. I'm not here to ask for favors. I'm here to make sure the people who serve this country are never pushed aside again. And if that means stepping into a fight I never wanted, then so be it. A murmur spread through the crowd. He met the cameras head on. This is just the beginning. The room erupted. Lucas grinned. Hell of a way to start a war. Elliot smirked. It's about time. As the cameras flashed and the voices rose, Elliot knew one thing for sure. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he never would be again. Elliot Gaines's story isn't just about one man. It's about every veteran who gave everything, only to come home and feel invisible. It's about fighting for recognition, for dignity, for the respect that should never have to be earned twice. His journey reminds us that real change doesn't start in the hands of politicians. It starts with those who refuse to stay silent. What do you think? Should Elliot have walked away, or was he right to take the fight to those in power? Let us know in the comments. And if you don't want to miss more stories like this, stories of resilience, justice, and the power of one voice, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got more to tell.